click the Go Live button right now.
Shall we first
so that we're not
maybe...
late.
Right. But, like, split up the script?
I'm happy to jump into things here and there, especially because I'm still kind of processing a lot of this paper. It's one of those like, oh, I don't really want to believe what he has to say, but maybe I have to. Maybe he's right. But I still don't know that I want to. I still don't know that I have to. Like, yeah.
I see.
Okay, I'm just checking that our stream is actually happening.
I think I'm gonna take some of the, the inflection is blah blah blah, derivation is blah 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 points in section 5. I'm gonna take some of them for myself because I found them quite interesting.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So are we already live or?
Yes, we are currently live.
Awesome.
Is there anyone watching?
I don't know.
Maybe I should look this up on YouTube and see if I can see any comments.
I'm currently watching so that I can find out if it's working or not.
Are we already live or? Oh no, I can hear myself.
Yeah. Oh. Alarm went off. That's awkward. All right. Well, let's just start it like a normal podcast then. See if we get any comments.
Yep. I have the window open to look at incoming comments.
That's good.
Perfect.
All right.
So anyone wants to take any other of these inflection is blah 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 points above the definition on the second page?
Let's see here. I am happy to do like all of them if you want.
I'm happy to just kind of interject with thoughts and things rather than presenting, because I'm not in a sense where it's like, yeah, I'm presenting this as, yes, this is, I agree with this and this is totally how things work. Like, sure, maybe, but
yeah, I'm also not entirely convinced, but I feel like it would be good to like present what the papers say.
Yeah, that's true.
People can actually just form their opinion.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, let's see. I can do some of these.
I've forgotten what color I am. Am I blue? I'm gonna be blue.
You're blue, yeah.
For anybody who is actually watching the stream or watches the recording of the stream later, you get an in-depth, behind-the-scenes view of how exactly we do
this is how we prepare to do things.
Yep.
I must say, this time I was really panicky about the schedule because I had like started to read the paper yesterday. And usually I start to read the paper like a week before because I barely get time more than 5 minutes to actually read it every day. So I need like 7 days to actually read the entire thing. But this time surprisingly it worked, I read it yesterday, I read one half, and today I read the other half, so it seemed to work. But yeah, it's pretty intense, because I got finals right now, so it's always a struggle to make time for something like that, but it's fun, so that's one pro argument in favor of doing this.
Yeah.
All right. Who wants to do the Lexeme thing at the end?
Hey! We've got at least one person who isn't one of us actually watching the stream, I think.
Hey, welcome! Hopefully I'm not saying that to no one.
All right.
Okay, I can also do this.
Oh, I just realized that our script document isn't actually on the stream video, so
That's probably good.
People just get to hear us talking about editing the script document.
I think we're good to go at this point, though.
I think we are.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we're good.
All right, so let me first do the proper introduction, because I'm Red, and Red starts.
Yep.
Welcome to Theory Neutral, the podcast about stuff languages do.
I'm Aiden.
I'm Logan.
And I'm Jacob, and today we're talking about inflection and derivation as traditional comparative concepts by Martin Haspelmath. And today we're actually live on YouTube, and I'm not sure, will we publish the recording of this on Spotify or anything like that? So we're not only live on YouTube, but also in the future will be on Spotify, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll edit everything like usual afterwards.
Right.
We will have a normal podcast come out of this. Well, mostly normal. So yeah, let's jump into talking about the paper. This is basically a paper where Martin Haspelmath goes in and says, okay, we have for literally millennia assumed that there are two kinds of morphology in languages. There is derivational and there is inflectional. Is there actually? And his argument is no. This is definitely one of those kinds of papers that, like, it can be very uncomfortable reading it because you're like, wait, but this is what I was taught. You know, this is not just a thing I was taught that now I have to get rid of. It's like there's a lot of what I was taught about linguistics that rests on this as some kind of foundation, and I'm going to have to, like, cart it over to something else and completely reinterpret a whole stack of stuff because now the foundation is under question. And I would say I'm still processing through a lot of the stuff in this paper and still thinking about it. I'm not entirely sure which side I fall on. I think there are still some things that I would like to ask questions about, but I think there's other points that it's like, yeah, that's kind of inescapably the case. So we will see where this goes.
I agree on that because, I had a similar thought when I first saw Logan post the paper on our Discord, and I was like, okay, what will Haspelmath say this time? Because I was sure I know Haspelmath, I know his style of papers, and it's really interesting because he seems to do this kind of groundwork, also like terminological questions, and so I was already suspecting that it will be on something in the direction of, okay, inflection and derivation as traditional comparative concepts. I suppose he doesn't like them. Apparently that was the case.
Yes.
And it's just like Aidan said. I read through the paper and I was like, that makes sense. But at the same time, wow, that's nothing I had ever thought about, because those categories, as you said, are so deeply ingrained in linguistic tradition, and also in just language learning textbooks, for example, or just anything that's got to do with language, that I never questioned them. And I think Haspelmath is great at writing papers who make you question theoretical notions like these.
Yeah, and to some degree, I feel like, I don't know, I don't have the greatest impression, like the greatest sense for Haspelmath as a researcher because I haven't read as much by him as I'd like to, but my sort of vague impression is that he's extremely conservative with setting up actual concepts in a cross-linguistic sense. And unless you have a very solid foundation for positing a cross-linguistic concept, he's going to be the guy to say, no, that's not a real thing. To some degree, it's like...
everything is language internal.
Exactly.
You've got like 5 significant digits of evidence that it happens in more than one language.
Exactly. And like, that's good to have that level of care and hesitance. I'm sometimes left questioning how much is it necessary to have that extreme of an approach to this. I don't know. I think it's a good question to ask, and if nothing else, even if Haspelmath turns out to be wrong about everything, it's like, oh yeah, all these were like legitimately reasonable concepts that we should completely use all the time. It's still incredibly valuable to have a voice saying, are we sure about that? And even if it gets annoying and every single thing you posit, they stop and say, are you sure about that? Like, you still gotta ask that question.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit of foreshadowing. At one point, he talks about French.
There's a running joke in our the grammar reading group that Logan and I and a few other people do that like eventually we will talk about French once a day. Like every session we will somehow mention French.
Every
French is
language
great.
does something like French.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I blame the French for that. Yeah. So
All right, so
the
let's
paper-
actually jump into talking about the paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You put in the notes, Aiden, that Haspelmath assumes that fuzzy definitions make fuzzy results, and fuzzy results are bad. And that is something that apparently you disagree with. I think I kind of disagree with that. Like things in the world are fuzzy sometimes, and that's okay. But on the other hand, I think the more important thing to note here is that inflection and derivation are frequently taught as not fuzzy things.
And that I would wholeheartedly agree is wrong. Yeah.
Yes, and if you don't have somebody pointing out to you that the definition is fuzzy, then you might very well start to think that these distinctions actually do exist in the real world, which, like, I certainly did because that's how I was trained. And that is a theoretical bias that will influence your analysis.
For sure. And to be fair to Haspelmath, I went back and reread some of that part of the paper after I put that in the notes, and he does say somewhat more specific things of it's not good to have continua with sort of not super well defined dimensions or like, you know, categories where you can have multiple different ways to get from one end of the category to the other end of the category, or you know, from one category to the other, because at that point you're starting to have things that it's like, are these real definitions? Are these real prototypical examples on each side of this or not? And I think, again, I'm not entirely sure I would put my foot down and say he's absolutely right. Like, if you can't sit down and say this is a single dimension continuum, or like, you know, a continuum on these points, you know, these, like a triangle, you know, these axes vary in these very specific ways, then it's not a real thing. Like, maybe it really is like, there's a prototype over here, there's a prototype over here, and there's all this complicated fuzzy space in the middle with a whole bunch of different reasons why it might be fuzzy. And like, maybe that's not a bad thing sometimes. But I do think it's again, it's worth examining that question and saying, maybe that isn't actually a great thing to have. Maybe it's not good to have two different prototypical situations that, like, well, you can change this variable and end up in the other camp, or you can change this completely unrelated variable and end up in the other camp. And like, I've done the same thing, like with tone and pitch accent. It's like, yeah, pitch accent isn't a thing on exactly those grounds, where you can change different, completely independent variables, and suddenly you have something that's pitch accent instead of tone. Like, that shouldn't be. Why don't we just call it all tone? So, you know, I am joining with the fundamental principles that Haspelmath is arguing for in a way that I think I didn't understand on the first read through.
Yeah, you got a little bit ahead of where I was going to talk about it, but at some point I would have also noted that Haspelmath's analysis feels very much like the case against pitch accent paper that we did in one of our earlier episodes.
Exactly. And I think I took that argument in rather easier than this one, only because I had not had this massive preconceived idea of like there is tone and there is pitch accent and they are different things, you know, calcified in my head over years of having it reinforced.
I think it also all depends on on intuition, because that's what Haspelmath talks about in section 4. This distinction between inflection and derivation is not only based on linguistic tradition, as we have talked about earlier, but it's also about intuition. And I think obviously those depend on each other. Like intuition is shaped by linguistic tradition, obviously, because if you if you hear from the beginning of your language learning career in elementary school, when you're learning in Germany, for example, when you're studying English for the first time, or I'm not sure what it looks like in America, but they always tell you that there is this division. And I would actually want to follow up on that because Haspelmath has a separate section for this intuition, and he calls this intuition, he describes this intuition as being that inflection is self-filling and derivation is lexicon enriching. And this is actually quite interesting because this basically says that inflection fills the cells of a paradigm, of a paradigm scheme, maybe. So, for example, we have inflectional categories in quotation marks, inflectional categories. For example, I'm not sure. We have the paradigm of Spanish verbs, Spanish present indicative active verbs. And then you have like this paradigm, and then through inflectional morphemes, the paradigm is filled. Yo, bivo, bivis, bive, bibivos, bibis, biven, something like that. While derivation, on the other hand, is intuitively enriching the lexicon and not filling any paradigm cells. But this is like Haspelmath kind of argues against it, as far as I have understood.
Yeah, well, I think the main point really is that what goes into a paradigm is completely arbitrary. So there's like certain traditional categories that we just assume are supposed to be inflectional, and so we put them in the paradigm table. But you could just leave some of them out, or you could put other ones in. So he says, for example, we do not say that singer is the agentive nominality form of sing. And that's true. But why the heck don't we? Like, why shouldn't we say that? Why isn't it in the paradigm? It's like in English, that particular derivation is completely regular, which is one of the hallmarks of inflection. And it does change categories. So it turns a verb into a noun, which that's supposed to be what derivation does. But then participles are adjectives. Participles turn verbs into adjectives, but we put participle forms into verb paradigms all the time. So that specific sentence, we do not say that singer is the agentive nominality form of sing. That was my mind-blowing moment where I suddenly got the whole paper, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. There's no difference. That
reminds me of the thing that we talked about. I think it was in the tone episode, where we talked about calling languages, I don't know, tone languages or click languages, as opposed to nasal languages or plosive languages, because I think that's in the same spirit. Because we call those things and we don't call these other things in the same way. And why is that? And I think that's really interesting from a terminological standpoint.
Yeah, it's all just a matter of familiarity.
Exactly.
Yeah, Haspelmath sort of, in a response to that, kind of brings up this concept of the grammar lexicon continuum, which I'm not sure if he is saying, oh yes, this is a better way to think about things, or if he's saying, oh, this doesn't go near far enough. But it is certainly like, it's even if it's a step in the direction Haspelmath wants us to go versus like actually getting us all the way, I think it's still a very helpful way to start thinking about things. Where there's no clear line between here is the grammatical system, here is the list of lexemes. Like, those are fundamentally either fuzzy lines or there's no line at all, and they're just the same thing. And, you know, he mentions that, like, you're going to have to mention lexical stuff in a grammar. You're going to have to mention grammatical stuff in a dictionary, no matter how hard a line you want to claim that there is. And exactly how dictionaries are structured is kind of often on a per language basis. And what counts as a separate form versus what counts as a form of the same one, like we've been talking about, is largely arbitrary. The things that you have to keep in mind, all of that stuff. Like, you know, it brings to mind the example that I've always heard of, like, Athabascan languages, where students have to, like, take a college level class on how to use your dictionary, because there's so much more complex grammar stuff that you just can't get out of putting in a dictionary, compared to, like, in English, where it's like, you look up the first letter of the word, and there's your word. Like, you know, it's way more complex because there's so much grammar stuff you can't get away from in the lexicon.
Yep. And so when Haspelmath references this in the paper, I think if I have read it correctly, he's talking about a theory about the psychological structure of human language. But just as Aidan was talking about, I love the idea of extending that to think of grammars and dictionaries as like actual works of literature existing on a gradient scale. Because like we have, this is another way that this whole distinction between inflection and derivation has like had significant consequences on how the world works, because we have grammars and we have dictionaries. But, like, for some languages, you have to put a ton of grammar into the dictionary to make it useful at all. And you can't write a grammar without putting some lexical information into it, you know, to write examples or whatever. So, like, there could be this third thing in the middle that is just, I don't know what to call it, the language documentation. It's just everything smushed together, and then a grammar and a dictionary at either end of the scale. But that's not how we do things, because tradition.
Yep. Yeah, and it's just to give some examples of like some of the ways in which this is clearly, like, we're going to go, I think, into a lot more detail in the future as to like what are some of the clearly, like, how do we get around this blurrinesses between derivation and inflection. But like, oftentimes it's thought of as like, well, you know, inflection has things like suppletion and periphrasis and irregularity and that sort of in that kind of a way. But, well, yeah, derivation does that sometimes too. Like, sometimes you have periphrastic constructions to derive agents, for example. You know, verb man, verb person as person who does the thing, for example, is in a language I've studied, and, you know, things like that. Like, you get those. And then on the flip side, like, yeah, it's like, well, derivation should be doing all of the class-changing stuff and the meaning-changing stuff and so forth. And it's like, well, on what level, like, yeah, participles are definitely have been considered inflectional for millennia. And you also have things like, well, maybe case inflection to some degree changes, like, especially oblique cases, like, those you can consider changing the class of a word, because now it's an adverb syntactically, or, you know, all sorts of things where it's like, honestly, there's a lot of overlap between the traditional categories properties that we have used for these.
Also, speaking of those properties that you just mentioned for derivation, that derivation can also have prefaces. Now we can fulfill the prophecy and talk about French.
Yes, there it is.
There, the Haspelmath gives an example from French from French game nouns and practitioner nouns. So, somebody who's plays chess, what is he called? So for bridge, the game is called bridge or bridge. I'm not sure. And then the practitioner is a bridgeur. And then for boule, it's boule. And practitioner is bouliste. So there's this definitely there is this morpheme which derives a practitioner of a game, but it's got different allomorphs. That's clear. But now, if we talk about Go, the game, we have the French term Go, and then we don't have goiste or goeur or something like that. We have the name of the practitioner, the noun is joueur de Go, so a player of Go. So in this case, we have this periphrasis where this one element Go cannot take any suffix like boule or bridge. So this is really interesting, and also allomorphy, as I just mentioned it, definitely exists in derivational systems too. So, for example, in English, if we want to form an inhabitant noun from a city, we have several allomorphs that are treated as belonging to the same morpheme, so to say. So we have London, Londoner, Rome, Roman, Vienna, Viennese. So we don't say Romer or Vienner, or we also don't say Londonan or Romese. We have this. There is a specific set, and so allomorphy is not exclusively inflectional, or periphrasis is not exclusively inflectional. And I think that just as two examples to strengthen your point, Aiden.
And I kind of want to flip that around because, like, to me, I feel like this argument was made backwards in the paper. Because, like, derivation isn't supposed to fit into a paradigm. So, like, you expect to have these kinds of variations. Like, derivation can do whatever it wants because it's derivation. But if we accept that as, like, diagnostic of derivation and then go look back at inflectional paradigms again, we've got this thing going on sometimes that we call suppletion. And, like, when it happens in a derivation or in an inflectional paradigm, it's suppletion. It's a thing that happens with inflection. But that's exactly the same thing that derivation does, where sometimes you just use different forms because you can, because of history or whatever. So, suppletion is, like, I'm not going to say that suppletion is a bad term. Like, it's a useful term once you're already thinking in terms of paradigms. But
yeah, exactly,
like,
because I think we would have to rid the term suppletion of this inflectional connotation, I think that is
that's
the
what
ultimate
I would like to do.
goal. Yeah,
I think it's a good term to keep around, but it's not actually a different thing between, it's not a special thing about inflection.
But that's actually a very good point, because as you might know, I'm working with GramBank, which is a typological database project, and we use these questionnaires, these large Excel sheets, to basically document how languages deal with things. And we also have quite some features about suppletion that we need to code. And in this case, suppletion is not at all tied to inflection or derivation, which is, I suppose, is a step forward from, for example, traditional grammars from the 70s or 80s, where you will definitely have suppletion being a purely inflectional concept. But I think we've moved on from that, and it's really refreshing to see that typological projects like GramBank rid this suppletion of this inflectional connotation, which is definitely something that is probably within the realm of what Haspelmath wants.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So before we move on to section 5 and the list of all of the things that are supposed to define inflection versus derivation, but actually don't, there's one more quote I want to extract from the paper about this cell filling versus lexicon enriching dichotomy. He says, finally, can we say that only derivation is lexicon enriching? This is certainly not true in the sense that inflected forms are not stored in the mental lexicon, because all psycholinguists agree that at least some inflected forms are stored. And then he references some previous studies on that subject. I just wanted to point out, that's how you get irregular forms. Like, irregularity exists because people store specific inflected forms, quote unquote inflected forms, in their mental lexicons, and so they don't get updated with all of the other regular changes.
I suppose that's one way you could also think about analogy in the sense of diachronic linguistics, because the people, the speakers, as you said, that's actually a nice wording. They don't store this diachronically accurate form of this verb conjugation, for example, but rather they take the patterns that they see on another verb and apply them to this new verb, and don't disregard the actual phonological sound change related accurately the accurate reflex. So that's also, I think you could point that in the direction of analogy as well.
Yeah, well, and that's how inflection is supposed to work. That you don't store the forms, you just derive them. You derive them newly every time you need them because it's regular. But then, it's also obvious that derived forms, which are supposed to be enriching the lexicon, are not all stored in the lexicon after all, because people come up with one-off derived forms all of the time. And that happens more often in some languages than in others, but I can derive new English words by compounding or sticking on long strings of affixes all day and come up with new quote-unquote derived terms that there's no way I had stored in my mental lexicon, and you definitely didn't either. So, yeah, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to do it live on stream. I'm going to derive a new English word that is definitely not in your mental lexicon. De-science fictionizer.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
What do you think that means, Aiden?
It sounds like somebody who takes a concept that is science fiction and turns it into reality. And I can see it going, yeah.
You got it!
Either by making it actually a real thing, or by taking the story and removing the science fiction elements. Either way. Yeah?
Yes. There, see? It works. So now we can say that all of those suffixes and affixes that I used are actually inflectional, because the resulting form was not stored in my mental lexicon.
So speaking of these features that inflection has, and these features that are not derivational.
Oh dear. Okay, we've got a great example in the chat.
Okay.
Somebody provided the additional example of where truffle Toberfestgate.
Oh yeah.
Which, I'm pretty sure I know exactly what that means, and it's very specific.
Yeah, it's those suffixes or prefixes are really fun. But speaking about the paper again, in section 5, Haspelmath basically talks about what does the literature think that inflection versus derivation actually is, but it actually isn't that, and kind of disproves that. It's quite interesting. He goes through all of these different phrases, and more of like a saying, or I'm not sure, wordings and says, yeah, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's also not true. So we will just present a few of these because there's quite a lot of them. So
There's
first
7.
of all,
we can do all of them. There's only
I
7.
mean, yeah, if we find the time, I suppose that works. So first of all, the misconception that he brings up first is that inflection preserves word class, whereas derivation can be transpositional. And by transpositional, he means that a noun becomes a verb or an adjective becomes an adverb. So he says that, inflection can also be transpositional. So, for example, participles. We think of the participles to be inflection. And we also think of participles to be transpositional because that's what they do. We have somebody, I see you, and he is seen. Obviously, or the seen man. Maybe that's not a nice example, but you know what I'm talking about. So, in this case, inflection does derive another word class from one word class. So there's another misconception that he addresses in his second section.
Hang on, before
Oh,
we go on to the second one,
Mhm.
the specific example that Haspelmath uses for point 1 is the creation of event nouns in lesbian.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got verbs turning into nouns, which you would think is probably derivational, but I don't know anything about lesbian except what is in this specific paper. But apparently it is traditional to include that particular form in the verb paradigm in that language. So
yeah. So as we have seen, inflection doesn't need to preserve word class. Inflection can be transpositional, which is I never thought of it, to be honest, but it makes sense. So I suppose it's pretty clear. Secondly, inflection is complete, whereas derivation can be incomplete. This is pretty easily what's it called? Pretty easily
debunked.
Thank you, debunked. Because inflections are like paradigms. Inflectional paradigms are also defective. Like there are cases in which there is no way or no standard to fill those cells, and so there might be a periphrastic form, or this applies not only to derivational paradigms. This also applies to inflectional paradigms. So there is, for example, okay, I'm lost. Give me a minute.
I'll fill the gap by saying one of the fun things that I remember from when I took Greek, biblical Greek, a long time ago, is there are 6 principal parts, which is the traditional term for verb forms you have to memorize because they will not be predictable, or mostly not be predictable from the base citation form of the word. There are 6 of those for every verb, but the actual list of verbs that have all 6 is very, very short. Most have 4 or 5, and it's not even the same 4 or 5. And to be fair, this is a language that's mostly attested, that is attested through text and not through we sat down and asked a speaker, what's the form in this box? So maybe there were some that just never got written down, but there's a whole lot of corpus in ancient Greek, and you would think that if they were really necessary, we would have got those. So it's just a very nice clear point of you definitely have defective paradigms, not just not just in a few places, but in sometimes on a language-wide scale.
Yeah.
Right.
So side note about meta stream stuff. Apparently, we were all supposed to be on video this whole time, and my Discord settings were weird. So now everybody is on video.
Oh,
Hooray!
okay.
Face reveal!
Yeah. What were you gonna say, Jacob? That you were thinking of?
No, I think we can move on because I was looking for an example of gappy inflection, but apparently there is none in this. But it's like I'm not sure. It's pretty obvious in this case that like everyone who's learned a language or who's been learning several languages has noticed that some verbs don't have a regular past form. Some verbs have need to use an auxiliary to form past. So there's a lot of examples, but
Yeah, English
Haspelmath doesn't
auxiliaries
give one.
are tremendously defective.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What's the future tense of can?
I cannot.
I will
Will
can.
be able to.
I will can do
Will
this.
be able to.
Yes, exactly. We'll be able to. Which
modal
paraphrastic.
stacking is a thing. Modal stacking is a thing.
Yes,
I will
that's true.
might can. I will might can.
You can't do those things, but I might could have is definitely a thing I would say.
True. Yeah.
But hey, analogy and regularization.
Exactly.
Yes.
Indeed.
Anyway.
So, next point. Inflection is supposed to provide a unique form, while derivation may offer a range of forms. So Haspelmath attacks this from both sides. He gives the example of the English irregular past tense. So take the verb to dream, and there is one cell in the paradigm for the past tense, but there's actually two possible forms in English. You can say dreamt or you can say dreamed, and those both exist.
Exactly.
So there is an overabundant cell in that paradigm. And then on the other hand, like morphology is, not morphology, derivation. Derivation is supposed to be able to produce multiple forms, no problem. And so he gives another English example of warmness versus warmth. They're both noun forms derived from the adjective warm. But we also see blocking effects in derivational morphology. And then he has, to demonstrate that, he's got a bunch of examples from Italian, which I am not going to try to pronounce because I will butcher them. So just go read example 15 in the paper. So yeah, you can have overabundance or you can have blocking and allomorphy in either situation.
Well, I can give an example of the example 15 here because you have like an adjective coraggioso, which means courage, and you could in theory derive that as coraggiosità, courageosity in English. But no, the actual nominalization is coraggio. You take off the derivational form. But if you have a malizioso, which means malice, you could say maliziosità, which is perfectly valid for maliciousness. But you can also just say malizia, which is also perfectly valid for the same thing. So in some cases you have there's a pre-existing form. Pietà for piety is the pre-existing form for or pity. I get pity is the word. I read it wrong. Pity is pietà. Piteous, full of pity is pietoso. You could also say pietosità, but that doesn't exist because that already exists. There's already a word that means that.
Yep. So blocking, just like you would expect from a paradigm with allomorphy.
Exactly. This is again one of those things. For me, blocking in a paradigm is just so normal, but it's in this context, it's just so provided in such an interesting way that it's actually fun reading about it. Because otherwise it would be just yeah, paradigms do that, paradigms do this. Okay, great. But in this case, it's used as an argument for something that is interesting, and I think it's pretty a pretty nice paper for that.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so
the next one, that inflection is productive, meaning that like you can prototypically inflection is productive, meaning you can apply a valid inflectional form to all roots of the class that should be able to take that form. Except also derivation can be very productive, just like we were talking about at the beginning with English singer, like that morpheme for like agent or tool nominalizer is very productive in English. And then like you have instances that Haspelmath points out with closed classes of, say, verbs, for example, where productiveness is just kind of a moot point. Like, there's only so many verbs. How do you know if the verb morphology is productive or not when you can't add a new verb to test it? It's just you just know all the forms for all the verbs because there's not any more verbs than that. He gives the example of Jaminjung, which has 33 inflectional verbs. It does a complex thing where you can get a lot more meaning by sticking a noun complement in front of a verb, and now you've got this sort of verb complex. But like in terms of like actual inflectional forms, there's only 33 verbs you can inflect. And so any verbal inflectional morphology is like, well, you can't tell if it's productive or not because you can't add a new verb to test it with and see if it can be extended. It has already been extended to everything it can possibly be extended to.
Yep. So those might very well just all be stored in the lexicon, and actually they're derivations.
Yeah, for all we know, you can't prove that either way.
Exactly. So next up, there is the misconception that inflection, I keep saying misconception, but it's misconceptions in the eyes of Haspelmath, obviously. We are still dealing with a paper that is presenting the opinion of Haspelmath. So
Yes.
a proposed misconception that inflection is semantically regular, whereas derivation need not be regular. So as an example, there is this Italian prefix, which is derivational, which is also, we have this in English, but Italian sounds a bit nicer, I think. So it's the prefix ri, and which is basically just, English re, I suppose. So, for example, rileggere, which is reread, or rispedire, which is send back. But on the other hand, few verbs that are marked by re, those have some rather idiosyncratic meanings. For example, there's chiedere, which is ask, and then richiedere is not ask again, but rather request. So generally, it's said that in traditional linguistics, it's said that the meaning of inflectional like paradigm cells are completely predictable. So they are regular. You can predict, okay, I have this stem and this suffix, and this means that this meaning is expected. But in this case, this isn't entirely true. So, for example, we have in German, we have the genitive of Abend, which means evening. So the genitive of Abend is Abends with the genitive s in German, but it doesn't mean of the evening, but it can also mean in the evening. Or, for example, in Russian, we have the word leto, which is summer. And then the instrumental of leto doesn't mean something like using summer or with summer, but rather it means in the summer. So we can see that.
Get them.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't speak Russian. I'm sorry. But
that's okay.
In this case, semantic drift can also appear in inflectional patterns, which is so it's not entirely confined to certain derivational patterns, but can also appear in inflection, which also makes sense from a diachronic perspective if we look at lexicalization, for example.
I do think this is a point where this is maybe the one point that I think is the weakest of Haspelmath's argument, because I think it's possible, just given the data that he gives us, which is not a whole lot, and yeah, I can't fault him for that. It's not a point, but like just based on that, could make the counter argument of, well, like maybe when an inflectional form gets this drift, it's not that that form now means a different thing. It's that now that form can be used in this different idiosyncratic way while still retaining its original predictable grammatical meaning if you're just using it in that inflectional way. And in that case, I think if that is what happens, which I am not claiming one way or the other, I'm just saying that that's a possible thing. If that is what happens, then I think you do have some grounds for saying there's a line between derivation and inflection. If an inflectional form is always available for a given meaning, even if it sometimes also doesn't have that meaning and has been extended to further uses. Yeah. And yeah, so I don't know, he may come back and say, he might be able to come back and say, yeah, no, absolutely, like, you can't, here's some examples of derivational forms that completely left a hole in their original position in the derivation chart, or maybe that's been filled by something else at this point, or, those sorts of things where it's like, okay, no, actually, those are situations that I would say that's a derivation, that's a sign of derivation, and it's totally happening with inflectional morphology. But he doesn't give a clear enough example to avoid that particular question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the next one, inflection is determined by syntax, but derivation is not. So this is another one we can attack from both sides. This is not an example that Haspelmath gives, but when I saw this, like, I didn't need to read the following paragraph because I was just like, no, it's not. Because here's my example. Tense is usually considered an inflectional category, but tense is not restricted by syntax. Like, you can put a verb in whatever tense you want for the meaning that you want, and it goes in the same syntactic slot in the sentence. So, yeah, inflection is not completely determined by syntax. But
it's not inflectional anyway by, yeah.
Yeah. But going from the other direction, this is what Haspelmath actually talks about. Sometimes derivations are required by the syntax. Like particularly with nominalizations. So he gives the example of, I admire Kim's sincerity. If you say, I admire Kim's sincere, that is ungrammatical in English. You have to put a noun derivation there to change the class of sincere from an adjective to a noun, because that is required by that syntactic position.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, sometimes inflection is not determined by syntax. Sometimes derivation is.
For the next one, Haspelmath mentions that, like, he like, one of the criticisms is like, well, or one of the potential options or differences is that inflection is obligatory and derivation isn't. Like, you have to have some marking for every inflectional category, but you don't have to have marking for a derivational category because, like, there could be potentially infinite of them. But, like, yeah, this is one where I read and I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely not the case. Like, there are definitely inflectional categories that you do not have to have a specification for one way or the other. You can just leave them completely unmarked. And maybe you can mark them one way, maybe you can't. But it's not necessarily the case that every inflectional category is, like, guaranteed to have a zero morph with some particular specification. And in some contexts, you even have situations where, like, you can't inflect something for a particular category because maybe this is a subordinate clause and tense is given by the main clause, and so there's just no way to do that. And it's not that, like, you have a predetermined tense value. It's just that tense is completely off the table for being marked under these circumstances. You're just not allowed to mark it.
Yep. So this
Mm-hmm.
This is not the direction that Haspelmath goes in the paper, but I feel like if we wanted to come up with a reasonable definition of inflection and derivation, this is what I would use for it. So if you're analyzing a language and you find out that some categories, some morphologically expressed categories, are in fact obligatory all the time, then like go ahead and slap an inflectional label on those, and everything else can be derivation. But that would not conform with how people have actually used it in the past. That's just, I think that would be a reasonable way to go about it. But that's just me, so whatever.
Do you have any good examples of? Yeah, he gives a good example of the Persian accusative case suffix. There's one that's obligatory with definite objects, but like he says, this is the only case suffix in the entire language. And do we now have like a paradigm with an opposition between accusative and non-accusative?
Yeah.
Where every other case marking is a zero morph non-accusative? Or do we just say, well, this is a accusative definite marker that appears for accusative definites, and then everything else is just unmarked?
Yeah, and lastly, there's also this this conception that certain meanings are inflectional and other meanings are derivational. And this is also, like Haspelmath says, this reasoning in distinguishing inflection versus derivation by lexical meaning is simply unreasonable, because we can say, okay, this category is inflectional and this category is derivational, but it is arbitrary. So, for example, we don't call future tense derivational because it's future, but we could at the same time we could just say, okay, we say that tense marking is derivational, and then it's derivational. So it's pretty arbitrary, and
yeah,
it's basically
I like the example. Oh, sorry, I'm interrupting.
Go on.
I like the example of Slavic aspect to demonstrate this, because usually aspect is like grouped together with tense and mood and considered an inflectional category. But Slavic languages have distinct lexical roots for different aspects, and there are means of transitioning words from one aspect group into another, but they're not completely regular, and they're usually looked at as being derivational. And like, Slavic languages are not weird and obscure. Like, this is a large, well-studied family where things just worked completely different from everywhere else, and this thing that is traditionally considered an inflectional category in this context is traditionally considered a derivational category with exactly the same semantics.
Right, and so I'm not even sure it's not the last section, but it's the section afterwards. Haspelmath basically gives definitions of inflection and derivation, which is at first, obviously, I was like, wait, why does Haspelmath define inflection and derivation if he's arguing that the distinction or that these categories actually don't exist? So the reason for this, he says, is that the terms will continue to be used anyway, even if this non-distinctness of the two kinds of constructions becomes a broad consensus among general linguists. So even if this Haspelmath paper goes off the roof and influences every future linguist, and everyone at universities suddenly says, oh yeah, we will teach it that this distinction isn't really strong, these two terms are still so deeply ingrained and entrenched in this entire discipline of linguistics that it's probably best to simply give some ad hoc, basic and simple, clear definitions, even if these concepts are not really any natural parts of languages, as he says. So the definition he gives for inflection, for example, is an inflectional construction is a construction in which an inflectional meaning role, person, number, gender, tense, mood, evidentiality, and polarity is expressed by an affix or non-concatenatively. So what made me think here is, what about new grammatical categories? Because science is always moving on, and there will always be new, like, for example, engagement. I think I mentioned it quite quite often now. Like, last in the episode with Professor Himmelman, I also talked about this super category of engagement. So, for example, every time there will be some new findings, you have to adapt the definition, which works because definitions are they are per se not entirely static. They can be fluid. They can change, but at the same time, it's making me think a bit, because we have so many, like, for example, I'm not sure, nominal tense or nominal mood. Those are not specifically separate from verbal tense or mood, but there's also different. They're very different from the verbal TAM. So there's so much playing into this. So I'm just not sure what to make of this definition actually.
So Haspelmath is basically saying, look, in practical terms, we've been using inflection to mean things that express this specific list of traditional concepts that we put in paradigms. So let's just define it that way. And, like, fine. I mean, I guess you had to do something, but I don't like it. I like my definition better. Everybody should use my proposed definition instead.
Remind us what that is.
If a category happens to be obligatory, then let's call it inflectional. And if it isn't obligatory, then let's call it derivation. Even though that's going to totally upend all traditional usage.
I do think both of those, I think, kind of get at maybe a core intuition about inflection versus derivation that Haspelmath doesn't really talk too directly about. And that is, inflection is considered to, like, we basically have a sense of, like, there are grammatical categories in a language. There are inflectional properties, basically grammatical properties that words can have, different based on the different word classes. And those are discrete per language lists, but still discrete lists of discrete categories that either, they may not be obligatory, but that those are properties that can be set to a certain value, including unset or left unset, for a given word in a given class. And each of those properties has a discrete set of settings that you can set it to. So, like tense, you have past, present, future. You can't have a word that actually has, one word over here has an extra fourth tense setting. Like, that's not a thing. Or like this word over here happens to just not have, this distinction. That's generally not how we think of grammatical categories. And so I feel like the intuition is, well, if we define inflection as a morpheme that gives a particular setting to one of these discrete categories, then it's inflectional, and then everything else is derivational. And that's kind of what Haspelmath's definition is getting at. It's just that I don't think he's taken out a whole lot of time in this paper to talk about that issue of, like, he's basically implying in this paper that the idea of grammatical category, if we take this a little bit farther, I think this is maybe a little bit of an overstatement. Like, based on his definition here, he's basically implying that idea of grammatical category as, discrete, quantized thing with a set number of possible settings that is available on every word of a given class, and maybe not on every in, like, noun, but, like, you've got a subclass of nouns that have this setting available. And he's saying that doesn't exist and that's not a real thing. Like, that's not fundamentally different from class-changing morphology or meaning-changing morphology or, and maybe he's right, but that's, I think, the core sticking point for about this is if you accept the idea that tense, for example, is a discrete setting with a discrete number of values that every verb has that isn't necessarily, every verb has or has some discrete reason to have that unspecified. Maybe you can leave it unspecified. And like the Persian example with the definite or the definite accusative marker, I think is an interesting counterexample. Because in that case, well, okay, maybe case is a little bit more squishy than every word has a setting for case or unspecified. And maybe you just said, well, that's unspecified, but maybe you could put everything in the unspecified box and then it becomes worthless. So that's something I think that's an exploration. And to say, like, is the idea of inflectional category a real thing? Grammatical category in that sense, not in the sense of like word class, but in the sense of like properties that you can append to a word, settings that you can set for each word. Is that a real thing? If so, I think there is a well-formed definition of inflectional morphology, and it's morphology that messes with those settings. If not, then Haspelmath is entirely right, and inflection and derivation aren't fundamentally at all.
Yeah, I suspect that this is one of those cases where reality is fuzzy, and you can find categories. You can find like prototypical grammatical categories with quantized settings for lots of things in lots of languages, and sure, let's call those inflection.
But also that it aligns with intuitions and the intuitions of people who deal with languages. And in this case, I think this is a step in the right direction. But I suppose if Haspelmath, I agree with Haspelmath on that point. So I think it's very hard to actually propose such a definition that is aligning with intuitions. But as a first step, I feel like these two definitions on page 18 are actually quite well formed. Obviously, with the additions of what you two just said, but in general, I think that it's a good way of going on about it.
Yeah, it's a good first step anyway.
Exactly.
We're thinking about this now.
For sure.
And I think we're done.
I think we are. Cool.
We are. Awesome. So this is the first time we ever did a live show, and would be nice to have some. Can you see how many people watch it over the time that we were talking, like in total?
Yes, I can. I'm gonna go ahead and end the stream now.
Okay.
Yes.
Bye, everyone. If everyone who's still around. And then I will end the recording as well.
Yes.